The blizzard had been raging for 2 days when Astrid Gulbrandsen stood at her window and watched Gunnar Eidsvoll stumble through waist-deep snow, desperately trying to reach his woodpile buried somewhere beneath the white expanse 50 yards from his cabin. She turned from the window, walked 3 steps to her door, opened it, and pulled dry firewood from the wall that encircled her home. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The wind screamed across the Montana Territory prairie with a violence that made the cabin timbers groan. Outside, the world had disappeared into white chaos. Inside, Astrid Gulbrandsen sat beside her stone fireplace, watching flames dance across split pine logs that had been perfectly dry when she'd retrieved them an hour earlier. The temperature outside had fallen to 20 degrees below zero. The wind drove that cold into something far more deadly, but her cabin remained warm, the fire steady, and her winter's supply of firewood remained accessible despite the blizzard that had buried the entire region. It was February of 1874, and this storm would be remembered as the worst in a decade. Already it had raged for 2 full days with no sign of breaking. Snow had accumulated to depths that made travel impossible, and visibility extended no more than a few feet. Homesteaders across the territory were trapped inside their cabins, rationing whatever firewood they had managed to bring inside before the storm hit. Some were running dangerously low. A few would not survive the next 2 days if the weather did not break. Astrid stood and walked to her window, a small opening fitted with real glass that life had insisted on buying despite the expense. Through it, she could barely make out the dark shape of Gunnar Eidsvoll's cabin 200 yards to the east. She watched as his door opened and a figure emerged, bundled against the cold, carrying a shovel. Gunnar was going for firewood. His woodpile was located in the traditional spot, roughly 50 yards from his cabin, in a small clearing where he had stacked it the previous autumn. By now that pile was buried beneath 5 feet of snow and growing deeper by the hour. Astrid watched Gunnar struggle forward, the wind knocking him sideways with every third step. He moved slowly, testing each footfall, the shovel gripped in both hands. She knew where he was headed, because she knew where every homesteader in the region kept their firewood. They all did it the same way. A clearing away from the cabin to reduce fire risk, stacked in cords between simple posts, exposed to the weather, because wood needed to dry and air needed to circulate. It was the method everyone used because it was the method everyone had always used. She watched until Gunnar disappeared completely into the white curtain of falling snow. Then she turned from the window, walked to her door and opened it. The wind hit her immediately, but she stepped out only 2 feet onto the covered porch Leif had built their first summer. Before her stood the wall, 7 feet of carefully stacked firewood, held in place by posts and horizontal frame pieces, forming a complete circle around her cabin. The wall stood solid against the storm, its top covered in snow, but its face dry and accessible. She reached forward, selected a piece of split pine from the section directly in front of her, pulled it free, selected another, and a third. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door. The entire process had taken less than 30 seconds. Astrid and Leif Gulbrandsen had arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1871. They came west from Minnesota, where they had spent 2 years working and saving money after emigrating from Norway. Leif had worked in a lumber mill. Astrid had taken in sewing and laundry. They lived in a single room above a dry goods store and put every spare dollar into a leather pouch hidden beneath a loose floorboard. By March of 1871, they had enough to file a homestead claim and purchase the basic supplies needed to start a new life. They traveled by wagon train to the southeastern corner of Montana Territory, to land near the tributaries of the Yellowstone River, where the government was offering claims to anyone willing to work them. The land was good, water was available, game was plentiful. The winters were harsh, but no worse than Norway, and Leif said the soil reminded him of his father's farm outside Bergen. They filed their claim on 80 acres that included a natural spring, a stand of pine trees suitable for lumber, and a gentle southern slope that would be ideal for crops. The first summer was devoted entirely to survival infrastructure. They lived in the wagon while Leif cut logs and built a cabin. The structure was simple but well made, typical of Norwegian construction: logs notched at the corners, fitted carefully to minimize gaps, chinked with moss and clay. A single room, 16 feet by 20 feet, with a loft space for sleeping and storage, one door facing south, one window fitted with oiled paper that would be replaced with glass when they could afford it. A stone fireplace in the north corner, built with flat rocks, Leif hauled from a creek bed 2 miles away. The roof was poles covered with sod, heavy and waterproof. By October, the cabin was finished and provisioned for winter. Leif had cut and stacked 8 cords of firewood in a clearing 50 yards from the cabin, the standard distance that balanced convenience with fire safety. They had smoked venison and packed it in salt. They had sacks of flour, cornmeal, and beans. They had seed saved for spring planting. That first winter tested them, but they survived it comfortably. The second year brought expansion. Life broke ground for crops and planted wheat, potatoes, and vegetables. The growing season was short but productive. Astrid established a chicken coop and acquired 6 hens from a neighboring homesteader. They replaced the oiled paper window with real glass purchased from a trading post 40 miles south. Leif built a small barn for the 2 oxen that had pulled their wagon west. By the autumn of 1872, their homestead was no longer a survival camp, but a functioning farm. They had neighbors scattered across the territory at distances ranging from a quarter mile to several miles. Most were families. A few were single men trying their luck. Everyone helped everyone else when help was needed, but mostly people kept to themselves, focused on the relentless work of homesteading. Astrid and Leif were considered successful, steady, and reliable. They were building something that would last. The winter of 1872 to 1873 arrived early. Snow fell in late October, unusual for the region, and temperatures dropped quickly. By November, the ground was frozen solid, and the creeks were showing ice along their edges. Leif said it reminded him of Norwegian winters when he was a boy. The kind of cold that settled in and refused to leave until spring forced it out. They were prepared. The harvest had been good. The cabin was tight and well insulated. Firewood was stacked and ready. Leif's winter routine was established and methodical. He rose before dawn, rebuilt the fire from overnight coals, and prepared coffee while Astrid dressed in the loft. After breakfast, he checked the livestock, ensuring the oxen and chickens had survived the night and had adequate feed and water. Then he spent the daylight hours on maintenance tasks, splitting additional firewood, repairing tools, reinforcing the barn against wind. On clear days, he might travel to check trap lines he had set along the creek, hoping to supplement their income with pelts that could be sold in spring. Every 3rd or 4th day, Leif made the trip to the woodpile to replenish the cabin's interior supply. The woodpile was located 50 yards northeast of the cabin in a small clearing where Leif had stacked 8 cords the previous summer. The location was standard practice among homesteaders, far enough from the cabin to prevent fire risk if lightning struck the pile. Close enough for convenient access during winter. The wood was stacked between vertical posts in the traditional manner, raised slightly off the ground on log foundations to promote air circulation and prevent rot. The system worked adequately under normal conditions. Leif would load a sled with enough wood to last 3 or 4 days, drag it back to the cabin, and stack it inside near the fireplace. The trips were cold but brief, manageable even in harsh weather. Astrid sometimes accompanied him, helping to load the sled and ensuring they selected properly seasoned wood. The arrangement seemed perfectly sensible. It was how everyone did it. December brought heavy snowfall. The accumulation was steady rather than dramatic, building gradually until the woodpile stood in snow that reached halfway up the stacked cords. Leif had to shovel a path to reach it, and loading the sled required clearing snow from the wood itself. The trips took longer but remained routine. By early January, the path was well established, packed down by repeated travel, and Leif joked that he could walk it blindfolded. On January 12th, the weather changed. The temperature dropped sharply overnight, falling to 30 degrees below zero. Wind began blowing from the north, steady and brutal, driving the cold into something far more dangerous than simple low temperature. Astrid woke to find frost thick on the inside of the window glass, despite the fire burning steadily in the fireplace. Leif said they should stay inside and keep the fire going strong. The interior wood supply ran low on the morning of January 14th. Leif checked the stack near the fireplace and estimated they had enough to last until evening, maybe into the next morning if they burned it carefully. But the temperature was still 30 below zero, and the wind had not stopped. Going outside meant exposure to conditions that could kill quickly, but staying warm required fuel. The decision was simple. Leif would make a quick trip to the woodpile, load the sled heavily, and return. 15 minutes in the cold, 20 at most. Astrid helped him dress. Heavy wool coat, fur hat with ear flaps, thick mittens, a scarf wrapped across his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. Leif pulled on boots lined with rabbit fur and stepped outside. Astrid watched from the window as he hitched the oxen to the sled. The animals were reluctant, their breath steaming in the savage cold, but they obeyed. Leif set out toward the woodpile, following the packed path he had traveled dozens of times before. The wind was worse than it had been in previous days. It blew directly from the north, across open prairie with nothing to slow it. Astrid could see Leif leaning into it, moving steadily but slowly. The oxen plodded forward with their heads down. She lost sight of him as he moved beyond the nearest trees, but she was not worried. He knew the route. The woodpile was clearly marked. He would load the sled and return. 30 minutes passed, then 40. Astrid began watching the window continuously, looking for movement. The wind had picked up further, driving snow horizontally across the ground. Visibility was deteriorating. She told herself that loading the sled was taking longer than expected, that Leif was being careful, selecting the driest wood, stacking it properly. But doubt began creeping into her thoughts. After an hour, she knew something was wrong. She dressed in her own winter clothing and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind tore at her coat and pulled her breath away. She could barely see 20 feet in any direction. She called Leif's name, but the wind swallowed the sound. She stepped off the porch and immediately sank into snow above her knees. The packed path Leif had made was already drifting over. She struggled forward, fighting through the drifts, calling continuously. The cold was terrifying. She could feel it working through her clothing, finding every gap, stealing warmth from her body. Her face went numb within minutes. She kept moving toward where the woodpile should be, knowing Leif had gone this direction, praying she would find him loading the sled. She found the oxen first. They were standing in the path, the empty sled still hitched behind them, covered in a thin layer of new snow. They had not moved. Astrid looked past them and saw the woodpile, partially buried, and then she saw Leif. He was lying in the snow 20 feet from the pile, on his side, one arm stretched forward as if reaching. Astrid could not move Leif's body alone. The cold had frozen him rigid, and the weight was too much for her. She covered him with her own coat and returned to the cabin. The storm continued for 2 more days. She kept the fire burning, using the wood Leif had stacked inside before his final trip. When the weather finally broke, she borrowed 2 oxen from Gunnar Eidsvold and brought Leif back to the cabin. The ground was frozen too hard to dig, so she wrapped him in canvas and stored him in the small barn until spring. The neighbors expected her to leave. Sigrid Nystrom came by in late January and gently suggested Astrid return to Minnesota to family who could care for her. Gunnar Eidsvold offered to buy her claim for a fair price. Anders Bjornstad, the traveling tradesman who passed through every few months, said he could arrange transport back east when the weather improved. Everyone was kind, everyone was concerned, and everyone assumed a woman alone could not possibly maintain a homestead through winter. Astrid thanked them for their concern and told them she was staying. She had no family in Minnesota, only distant cousins who had never approved of her marriage to Leif. Her parents were dead. Her brother had remained in Norway. This cabin, this land, this claim was hers and Leif's together. Leaving would mean abandoning everything they had built and everything Leif had died trying to protect. She would not do that. The winter continued. Astrid maintained the homestead alone. She fed the livestock. She kept the fire burning. She rationed her food supplies carefully. The trips to the woodpile terrified her, but she made them anyway, loading small amounts she could carry herself, never taking the oxen, never staying outside longer than absolutely necessary. Every trip was a confrontation with the place where Leif had died. Every trip reinforced the brutal reality that their woodpile, arranged in the manner everyone considered proper and safe, had killed him. She thought about it constantly. The woodpile was 50 yards from the cabin. In good weather, that distance was nothing. In a blizzard, it became a deadly gap. The wood was stacked in an open clearing exposed to wind and snow. By midwinter, reaching it required shoveling, fighting through drifts, exposing yourself to conditions that could kill in minutes. The traditional arrangement that every homesteader used was designed for convenience in summer and autumn. It was not designed for survival in extreme winter conditions. When the thaw came in March, Astrid buried Leif on a hillside overlooking their land. She marked the grave with stones and stood there alone, making a decision. She would not leave. She would not abandon the homestead, but she would not continue doing things the way they had always been done simply because tradition demanded it. The woodpile had killed Leif. She would make certain it could never kill anyone else. The obsession that would change frontier construction practices across the territory began that day, standing at Leif's grave, looking back at the cabin and the deadly gap between shelter and fuel. Spring turned to summer. Astrid worked the land alone, planting crops with the help of neighbors who insisted on assisting despite her protests. The wheat and potatoes grew. The chickens laid eggs. The homestead continued functioning, but Astrid's mind was elsewhere. She had become fixated on a single question that consumed her thoughts during every waking hour. How could she ensure she never died trying to reach Firewood? She began visiting neighboring homesteads, studying how everyone stored their winter fuel. Gunnar Eidsvold's woodpile was located 40 yards from his cabin in a stand of trees. Anders Larsson, a Swedish homesteader 3 miles south, kept his wood 60 yards away near his small barn. Sigrid Nystrom and her husband Carl stacked their supply 30 yards behind their cabin in an open area cleared specifically for that purpose. Every single homesteader followed the same basic pattern, wood stored away from the dwelling. Distance, maintained for fire safety. Exposure accepted as necessary for proper drying. Astrid also studied the evidence of winter damage. At nearly every homestead, she saw signs of desperate struggles to reach buried wood piles, paths that had been shoveled repeatedly through deep snow, areas where drifts had accumulated to heights of 6 or 7 feet, wood that had been partially buried and then dug out, showing water damage from melted snow that had refrozen. Several homesteaders mentioned close calls during the worst storms of the previous winter, times when retrieving firewood had been genuinely dangerous. She talked with Sigrid Nystrom extensively about winter wood access. Sigrid was a practical woman, Norwegian, like Astrid, who had survived 5 winters in the territory. She described the fear that came when the interior wood supply ran low during a storm. The calculation every homesteader made, weighing the need for warmth against the danger of going outside, the times her husband Carl had returned from the woodpile with frostbite on his face or hands. The anxiety that built as winter progressed, and the woodpile became increasingly difficult to reach. Other women shared similar stories. Everyone accepted these dangers as simply part of frontier life. Winter was harsh. Accessing firewood was difficult. Sometimes people got hurt. Occasionally people died. That was the reality of homesteading in Montana Territory. You adapted, you survived, or you did not. Complaining accomplished nothing. But Astrid was not interested in complaining. She was interested in engineering. The problem was clear. The solution everyone used was inadequate. Traditional woodpile placement prioritized fire safety and summer convenience while creating winter danger. Every homesteader accepted this trade-off because no alternative existed. But Astrid began to believe an alternative was possible. She simply had to remember how things had been done elsewhere. She thought constantly about Norway, about her childhood on her father's farm outside Bergen. The winters there had been as harsh as Montana, sometimes worse. But she could not remember her father ever struggling to reach firewood during storms. The wood had always been close, accessible, protected. Where exactly had it been stored? The memory came to Astrid in late June while she was repairing the chicken coop. She was thinking about winter, about snow, about her father's farm, and suddenly she could see it clearly. The farmhouse in Norway, the barn 40 feet away. And between them, stacked against the barn's south wall, an enormous pile of split firewood, not in a separate clearing, not away from the buildings, directly against the wall, stretching the entire length of the barn, stacked as high as her father could reach. She remembered asking him once why he stacked the wood there, instead of in the open, where it could dry better. Her father had laughed and said, wood dried perfectly well against a wall if you stacked it properly with airspace between the pieces. More importantly, he said, wood stacked against the barn wall was accessible in any weather. He could step out of the house, walk a few feet to the barn, and gather firewood, without ever exposing himself to open wind or deep drifts. The barn itself blocked the worst of the weather. The memory expanded. She remembered other farms in their valley. Many used the same method. Firewood stacked against barn walls, storage sheds, even along the sides of houses themselves when the construction allowed it. The wood was kept close, kept accessible, and the buildings provided natural protection from wind and drifting snow. It was practical, efficient, and safe. But there was another memory, fainter but more intriguing. When Astrid was 12, her family had traveled into the mountains to visit her mother's uncle, a man who lived alone on a remote farm in a high valley where winter lasted 8 months. His farm was unlike anything Astrid had seen. The small house sat in the center of a courtyard, and surrounding that house, forming a complete square, was a wall made entirely of stacked firewood. Not wood piled against buildings, but wood stacked between posts and frames to create an actual wall structure. She remembered walking around that wall with her cousin, marveling at how much wood it held. Her uncle explained that he cut and stacked firewood all summer, building the wall higher and thicker each year. By winter, he had an enormous supply immediately accessible from his door. The wall also blocked wind, he said, which meant his house stayed warmer and required less fuel. He could survive an entire winter without ever needing to venture beyond his firewood wall, even if snow buried everything else on the farm. At the time, Astrid had thought it strange, but clever. Now, standing in Montana Territory beside her chicken coop, the memory felt like revelation. Her uncle had solved the exact problem she faced. He had brought the firewood to the house instead of forcing himself to go to the firewood. He had turned storage into structure, combining shelter and fuel supply into a single integrated system. The idea took hold in her mind with immediate intensity. What if she built a wall of firewood around her cabin, not a pile against one wall, but an actual perimeter wall encircling the entire structure. It would hold enough wood for a full winter. It would be accessible in any weather. It would block wind and protect the cabin. And it would eliminate the deadly gap between shelter and fuel that had killed life. Astrid spent the next week thinking about nothing except the firewood wall. She walked circles around her cabin, measuring distances with paces, estimating dimensions, calculating quantities. The cabin was 16 feet by 20 feet, a simple rectangle. If she built a wall 7 feet from the cabin on all sides, the perimeter would be roughly 120 feet. If she stacked the wall 7 feet high and 3 feet deep, how much wood would that hold? She worked the mathematics on a piece of slate, calculating volume. A wall 120 feet long, 7 feet high, and 3 feet deep contained 2,520 cubic feet of space. A standard cord of firewood was 128 cubic feet. That meant her wall could hold nearly 20 cords of wood. She and Leif had used approximately 8 cords the previous winter. A wall holding 20 cords would supply fuel for 2 full winters, possibly 3 if she burned efficiently. The numbers excited her, but numbers alone would not build the wall. She needed a construction method that would keep the stacked wood stable, prevent it from toppling, and allow her to remove pieces for burning without collapsing the entire structure. She could not simply pile wood in a ring around the cabin. It needed support, structure, and careful engineering. She began sketching in the dirt outside her cabin. She drew the cabin outline, then a larger rectangle around it representing the wall. She marked posts at regular intervals around the perimeter. The posts would be driven into the ground and provide vertical support. Between the posts, she could attach horizontal frame pieces, creating sections. Each section would hold stacked firewood contained within the frame structure. If one section was emptied, the others would remain stable. The design evolved over several days. She decided on posts every 8 feet around the entire perimeter. That would require 15 posts total. Between each pair of posts, she would attach 3 horizontal frame pieces at ground level, mid-height, and near the top. The frame pieces would be simple planks nailed to the posts, creating rectangular sections that would contain the stacked wood. The wood itself would be stacked horizontally, bark side facing outward for weather resistance, with small gaps between pieces to allow air circulation. She sketched the wall from different angles, imagining how it would look, how it would function. The posts would need to be substantial, at least 6 inches in diameter, and buried 2 feet deep for stability. The frame pieces could be rough-cut planks, nothing fancy, just strong enough to hold the weight of stacked wood. The wood itself would be split to uniform size, approximately 16 inches long, the standard length that fit well in her fireplace. One detail troubled her. How would she access the interior sections? If the wall completely encircled the cabin, she would need a way to reach the wood from inside the perimeter. The solution was simple. She would leave a gap for a door, a section without stacked wood that would allow her to pass through the wall. That opening would face south, protected from the worst winter winds. In late July, Astrid hitched her oxen to the wagon and made the 40-mile journey south to the trading post. The trip took 2 days. She brought eggs, vegetables from her garden, and a small amount of money saved from the previous year. She needed lumber. Specifically, she needed 15 posts and enough planking to create horizontal frames around her entire cabin perimeter. The wood at the trading post was expensive, shipped from distant mills, but it was cut to consistent dimensions and far superior to anything she could produce herself with hand tools. Anders Bjornstad was at the trading post when she arrived. He was a man in his 50s, Swedish by birth, who traveled a circuit through the territory selling goods and buying furs. He knew every homesteader within 100 miles and made his living understanding what people needed before they asked. When he saw Astrid examining lumber, he walked over and asked what she was building. Astrid explained her plan. She was going to build a wall of firewood around her cabin. The wall would be 7 feet tall, supported by posts and frames, and would hold enough wood to last multiple winters. The wood would stay dry, remain accessible regardless of weather, and the wall would protect her cabin from wind. She would never again need to risk her life walking through a blizzard to reach a buried woodpile. Anders listened carefully. Then he asked why she did not simply stack firewood closer to the cabin in the traditional manner. Astrid said traditional methods had killed her husband. Anders paused, then asked if she had considered the cost. The lumber she was describing would be expensive. Astrid said she had considered it and was willing to pay. Anders asked if she had considered the labor. Building such a wall would take weeks, possibly months. Astrid said she had all summer. Anders purchased the lumber for her, negotiating a better price than she could have obtained alone. But as he loaded the posts and planks onto her wagon, he mentioned that he would be traveling through her area in the autumn. He was curious to see if she actually built this wall, or if the idea would fade once she confronted the reality of the work involved. His tone was not mocking, but it was skeptical. Astrid said he was welcome to visit. The journey home took 3 days because the loaded wagon moved slowly. When Astrid arrived at her homestead, Gunnar Eidsvold was visiting, checking on her as he did periodically. He saw the lumber and asked what construction project required so much material. Astrid explained. Gunnar stared at her for a long moment, then said she was building a wooden fortress. He asked if she expected attacks from hostile tribes. Astrid said she expected attacks from winter. Gunnar shook his head and left, muttering about grief making people irrational. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteading community. Astrid Gulbrandsen was building a wall around her cabin, a wall made of firewood. The story was shared with confusion, concern, and amusement. Astrid began construction in early August. The first task was marking the wall's perimeter. She used stakes and rope to outline a rectangle 7 feet from her cabin on all sides. Then she marked the post locations, measuring carefully to ensure even spacing. 15 posts total, positioned to create equal sections around the entire perimeter, except for the southern gap that would serve as her entrance. Digging the post holes was brutal work. The ground was hard, baked by summer sun, and she needed each hole 2 feet deep to provide adequate stability. She used a shovel and an iron bar to break through the compacted soil and rocks. Each hole took hours. She dug in the early morning when the temperature was coolest, worked until the heat became unbearable, then rested in the shade before resuming in late afternoon. Gunnar Eidsvold stopped by while she was digging the 4th hole. He watched her work for several minutes without speaking. Then he asked if she truly intended to stack firewood 7 feet high in a circle around her cabin. Astrid said that was exactly her intention. Gunnar said it was the most foolish construction project he had witnessed in 20 years of frontier living. She was wasting lumber, wasting labor, and building something that would accomplish nothing except making her look insane. Astrid thanked him for his opinion and continued digging. Other neighbors visited over the following weeks. Some offered help, which Astrid politely declined. She wanted to build the wall herself, to understand every aspect of its construction. Others came simply to observe and comment. The comments ranged from gentle concern to open mockery. Several people suggested she was grief-stricken and not thinking clearly. One neighbor said she was building a jail cell and would regret it by winter. Another said firewood needed to be stacked in open areas where sun and wind could dry it properly, not trapped in a wall where moisture would accumulate. Astrid listened to all the commentary without arguing. She simply continued working. By mid-August, all 15 posts were set, and the concrete she had mixed from lime and sand had hardened around their bases. The posts stood solid, 6 inches in diameter, extending 7 feet above ground. They looked strange. A circle of vertical timber surrounding her cabin with no obvious purpose. The mockery intensified. Attaching the horizontal frame pieces required carpentry skills Astrid had learned from her father. She measured and cut planks to span between posts, then secured them with nails driven at angles to ensure strong connections. She installed 3 horizontal pieces between each pair of posts, one at ground level, one at mid-height, and one near the top. The work was slow and precise. Each connection had to be solid because the frame would eventually support tremendous weight. By early September, the frame was complete. The structure now resembled a skeleton, posts and planks forming rectangular sections around the cabin perimeter. Gunnar visited again and called it Astrid's wooden cage. He asked if she planned to keep livestock inside. Astrid said she planned to keep herself warm. The frame construction had taught Astrid important lessons about stability and load distribution. Each post bore weight not just from above, but from lateral pressure as stacked wood pushed outward against the horizontal planks. She had reinforced the connections between posts and frame pieces using diagonal bracing in the corners, creating triangular supports that prevented the structure from racking sideways under load. The engineering was simple but effective, principles her father had used when building barn structures in Norway. The posts themselves were pine, selected for straightness and lack of significant knots that would create weak points. She had stripped the bark completely before setting them, knowing that bark retained moisture and would rot over time. The exposed wood would weather but remain structurally sound for years, possibly decades, if she maintained it properly. Each post was buried, 2 feet deep with the hole packed tight with soil and small rocks, then topped with a concrete mixture that locked everything in place. The horizontal frame pieces were rough-cut planks, 2 inches thick and 8 inches wide. They did not need to be beautiful, only functional. She had positioned the lowest plank 6 inches above ground level to prevent direct soil contact that would accelerate rot. The middle plank sat at 42 inches, roughly mid-height of the eventual wood stack. The top plank was positioned at 84 inches, 7 feet above ground, which would be the maximum height of stacked firewood. Between these horizontal supports, Astrid had added vertical slats every 2 feet. These thin pieces of wood prevented the stacked firewood from pushing through the gaps between horizontal planks. They created a basket effect, containing the wood on all sides while still allowing air to circulate. The entire system was overbuilt by normal standards, far stronger than necessary for simply holding firewood, but Astrid wanted no possibility of failure. The physical work had been exhausting. Her hands developed calluses, and her shoulders ached from swinging the hammer to drive hundreds of nails. But the labor was also meditative. Each post set, each plank attached, each brace installed brought her closer to a system that would protect her. She worked with careful attention to detail, checking measurements multiple times, ensuring every connection was solid. Mistakes now would create problems later, and she could not afford problems when winter came. By mid-September, the frame stood complete and ready. The structure formed a precise rectangle around her cabin with one gap on the south side for access. From a distance, it looked strange and purposeless, a cage of wood with nothing inside. Neighbors who passed by shook their heads. Sigrid Nystrom stopped to ask if Astrid needed help with anything, clearly concerned. Gunnar Eidsvold made another comment about fortresses, this time suggesting Astrid was preparing to defend herself against imaginary threats. Astrid ignored all commentary. The frame was finished. Now came the truly massive task of cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking enough firewood to fill the structure. She estimated she would need approximately 20 cords. She had all autumn to cut it. The work would be brutal, but she had endured brutal work before. She sharpened her axe and began. Cutting 20 cords of firewood was a monumental task for one person. A cord measured 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, containing 128 cubic feet of tightly stacked wood. 20 cords meant cutting, splitting, and stacking enough wood to fill a space 16 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and 40 feet long if arranged in a single pile. Spread around the perimeter of Astrid's wall frame, it would create a barrier 3 feet thick and 7 feet high, encircling her entire cabin. She worked systematically. Each morning she walked to the stand of pine trees on the eastern edge of her property and selected trees for cutting. She chose trees that were dead or dying, understanding that green wood contained too much moisture and would not burn efficiently. Dead standing timber was ideal, already partially dried, with bark that came off easily. She felled trees using a two-man crosscut saw, working it alone by attaching one handle to a spring pole that pulled the saw back while she pulled it forward. The method was slower than working with a partner, but entirely feasible. Once a tree was down, she cut it into 16-inch lengths using the crosscut saw. 16 inches was the standard firewood length that fit her fireplace efficiently. Each tree yielded dozens of rounds that she split using a maul and wedges. Splitting was hard work, but followed simple principles. She looked for natural cracks in the wood and placed her wedge there, driving it deep with the maul until the round split apart. Pine split relatively easily compared to hardwoods, especially when properly dried. She hauled the split wood to the cabin using her oxen and a sledge. Each load held approximately a quarter cord. She made 4 or 5 trips per day, weather permitting, gradually accumulating wood near the frame structure. By early October, she had cut and hauled approximately 8 cords. The pile grew steadily, a mountain of split pine waiting to be stacked into the wall. Stacking required as much care as the frame construction. Astrid developed a specific technique. She placed each piece horizontally with the bark side facing outward. Bark provided natural weather resistance, shedding water better than exposed wood. She fitted pieces tightly together, but left small gaps for air circulation, understanding that airflow prevented moisture accumulation and mold growth. Each layer was placed perpendicular to the layer below, creating a cross-hatched pattern that added stability. She started at the bottom, filling the lowest section of frame between 2 posts. The wood rested on the bottom horizontal plank, held in place by the vertical slats on the sides. She worked upward, layer by layer, until the section was filled to the top plank. Then she moved to the next section. The process was repetitive but satisfying. The wall took shape gradually, transforming from empty frame to solid barrier. By late October, she had filled 6 of the 14 sections. The wall was beginning to look like what she had envisioned. Neighbors who passed by were quieter now, less mocking, more curious. The structure was undeniably impressive, even if its purpose remained unclear to most observers. November brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and the ground hardened. Astrid worked faster, knowing she needed to finish before winter made cutting and hauling wood impossible. She rose before dawn and worked until darkness forced her to stop. Her body ached constantly, but she pushed through the pain. The wall had to be completed. She had developed remarkable efficiency in her cutting and stacking routine. What had taken her an entire day in August now took half that time. Her axe strokes were precise, her splitting technique refined through repetition. She could judge a tree's quality from a distance, knowing which would split cleanly and which would be difficult. She stacked wood with practiced rhythm, fitting pieces together like a puzzle, maximizing density while maintaining airflow. The oxen had learned the routine as well. They walked the path between the timber stand and cabin without guidance, stopping automatically at the correct locations. Astrid sometimes wondered if they understood what she was building or if they simply followed habit. Either way, they were patient partners in the work. By mid-November, only 3 sections remained empty. The wall now encircled most of the cabin, a solid barrier of stacked firewood, rising 7 feet high. The transformation was dramatic. What had been an open homestead with an exposed cabin was now a fortified compound. The cabin sat protected within walls of fuel, accessible only through the southern gap Astrid had left for her entrance. She filled the final sections in late November, working through light snow that had begun falling intermittently. The last piece of wood went into place on November 28, 1873. Astrid stepped back and examined her work. The wall was complete. 120 feet of perimeter, 7 feet high, 3 feet thick, containing enough firewood to last 3 winters if needed. The structure stood solid and impressive, unlike anything else in the territory. Gunnar Eidsvoll rode by the next day. He stopped his horse and stared at the completed wall for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said it was the strangest thing he had ever seen a homesteader build. He called it Astrid's wooden castle and asked if she planned to charge admission for neighbors to view it. His tone was still mocking, but carried an undertone of something else, perhaps grudging respect for the sheer magnitude of work she had completed alone. Sigrid Nystrom visited in early December. She walked around the entire perimeter, examining the construction closely. She asked detailed questions about the frame structure, the stacking technique, and how Astrid planned to remove wood for burning without collapsing sections. Astrid explained that she would take wood from the interior-facing side of each section, working from top to bottom. The frame would hold the remaining wood in place, even as sections were partially emptied. Sigrid nodded thoughtfully. She said the wall blocked wind remarkably well. Standing inside the perimeter felt noticeably warmer than standing outside, even though there was no roof. Astrid had noticed the same thing. The wall created a microclimate, a sheltered zone where wind could not penetrate. December brought steady cold and occasional snow. Astrid prepared for winter inside her completed wall, feeling a security she had not experienced since before Leif's death. The cabin was provisioned with food stores, the livestock were sheltered and fed, and her firewood supply was immediately accessible in any weather. She had accomplished what she set out to do. Now she would discover if her engineering was sound or if the neighbors' skepticism was justified. The first benefit became apparent immediately. Wind no longer hit the cabin with full force. Before the wall, winter winds had blown directly across the open prairie and slammed into the cabin's walls, finding every gap in the chinking and making the interior difficult to heat. Now the wind hit the firewood wall first, losing velocity as it passed through the small gaps between stacked pieces. By the time it reached the cabin, it was significantly diminished. The temperature difference was measurable. Astrid began noting the interior cabin temperature each morning using a thermometer Leif had purchased years earlier. With the firewood wall in place, the cabin stayed 5 to 8 degrees warmer than it had the previous winter, even when the exterior temperature was identical. She was burning less wood to maintain comfort, which meant her massive supply would last even longer than calculated. The space between the wall and cabin became a sheltered zone where Astrid could work outside without full exposure to weather. She could feed the chickens, check on the oxen, or perform maintenance tasks while protected from wind. The psychological benefit was as significant as the physical one. She no longer felt trapped inside during storms or forced to choose between freezing and risking her life outside. Accessing firewood was effortless. She had left the interior face of the wall unfinished, meaning she could simply reach into any section and pull out pieces as needed. She did not need to open a door or step. Outside the protected perimeter, she could stand on her porch, reach to the wall 3 feet away, and gather an armload of dry wood in seconds. The convenience was extraordinary compared to the old system of trudging 50 yards through snow to a buried pile. She noticed the wood stayed remarkably dry despite snow accumulating on top of the wall. Her stacking technique allowed air to circulate, while the bark side-out orientation shed water effectively. Snow that landed on the wall's top melted slightly during day when sun appeared, but the moisture drained downward through the gaps and never penetrated deep into the stacked wood. The interior pieces remained as dry as if stored in a covered shed. Neighbors began visiting more frequently, curious about how the wall was functioning. The mockery had faded, replaced by genuine interest. Several people asked if the wall made the cabin warmer. Astrid confirmed it did. They asked if accessing firewood was truly convenient. She demonstrated by walking to the wall and pulling out several pieces without effort. They asked if she worried about the structure collapsing. She showed them the solid frame construction that made collapse impossible. The first significant storm hit in mid-December. Snow fell steadily for 18 hours, accumulating to depths of 2 feet in open areas. Wind blew from the northwest, driving the snow into drifts that reached 4 and 5 feet in sheltered locations. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. It was a serious storm, but not exceptional by Montana Territory standards. Astrid watched it from her window, warm inside her cabin, and felt no anxiety whatsoever. She maintained her fire easily throughout the storm. Every few hours she walked to her door, stepped onto the porch, and pulled fresh wood from the wall. The process took 30 seconds. She never exposed herself to the full force of the wind. She never struggled through deep snow. She never worried about whether she could reach her fuel supply. The system worked exactly as she had envisioned. She thought about Leif constantly during that storm. If he had been alive, if they had not built the wall, he would have been making dangerous trips to the old woodpile location 50 yards away. He would have been fighting through drifts, exposing himself to killing cold, risking frostbite, or worse. The woodpile would have been buried and difficult to access. Each trip would have been an ordeal and a risk. But with the wall, there was no risk. There was no ordeal. There was simply reaching out and taking what she needed from an inexhaustible supply 3 feet from her door. The wall had eliminated the danger entirely. She had solved the problem that killed her husband. When the storm cleared, Astrid walked outside to assess conditions. Snow had drifted against the exterior of her firewood wall, creating slopes that in some places reached nearly to the top. But inside the perimeter, the snow was significantly shallower, only 12 to 18 inches deep. The wall had blocked the wind and prevented drifting within the protected zone. She could walk easily around the interior perimeter, checking the structure and ensuring everything remained stable. She looked beyond her wall toward neighboring homesteads. Gunnar Eidsvold's cabin was barely visible through remaining snow flurries, but she could see his woodpile, or rather, where his woodpile should be. It was completely buried beneath a drift. She knew he would need to shovel extensively before he could access firewood. The same was true for every neighbor who used traditional storage methods. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Traditional woodpile placement created problems during winter storms. Her wall eliminated those problems. The validation she felt was not triumphant, but quietly satisfied. She had identified a flaw in standard practice, engineered a solution, and proven through actual winter conditions that her solution worked. A second storm arrived a week later, this one bringing less snow but more wind. Temperatures fell to 25 below zero and stayed there for 4 days. Astrid remained comfortable inside her cabin, burning wood steadily, never once concerned about access or supply. The wall stood solid against the wind. The wood remained dry and accessible, and the system proved itself repeatedly. February of 1874 brought a blizzard that would be discussed across the territory for years. The storm developed rapidly on February 9th, moving down from the Canadian territories with unprecedented speed and violence. By midday, visibility was reduced to a few feet, and wind speeds exceeded anything most homesteaders had experienced. Snow fell so heavily that accumulation could be measured in inches per hour. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, and the wind drove that cold into something genuinely deadly. Astrid watched the storm develop from her window. She had seen the sky change color that morning, a peculiar greenish-gray that old-timers said indicated major weather approaching. By noon, the world outside had disappeared into white chaos. She fed her fire, checked her supplies, and settled in to wait. She had plenty of firewood, plenty of food, and a cabin that would protect her. The storm could rage for days if necessary. She would be fine. The blizzard continued through that night and into the next day. Snow piled against her firewood wall, building drifts that climbed the exterior face. But inside her protected perimeter, accumulation was minimal. The wall blocked the wind and prevented the driving snow from reaching the interior zone. She could open her door and see relatively clear ground just beyond her porch. The contrast between interior calm and exterior violence was remarkable. On the second day, she saw movement through the storm. Someone was outside, struggling through the deep snow. She watched as the figure moved slowly, falling several times, pushing forward with obvious desperation. It was Gunnar Eidsvold. He was trying to reach his woodpile, buried somewhere beneath the drifts. She could see him probing with a shovel, searching for the pile he knew was there, but could not locate. The wind kept knocking him down. His movements were becoming slower, less coordinated. Astrid pulled on her coat and stepped outside. She called to Gunnar, but the wind swallowed her voice. She watched him fall again, struggle to rise, then collapse into the snow and remain there. She knew hypothermia when she saw it. Gunnar was dying 50 yards from his own cabin, killed by the same conditions that had killed life. She fought through the snow between her wall and Gunnar's position. The distance was nearly 200 yards and the effort was exhausting. But she reached him, grabbed his coat, and dragged him back toward her cabin. He was semi-conscious, mumbling incoherently. She got him inside her perimeter, wall through her door, and positioned near her fire. She removed his frozen outer clothing and wrapped him in blankets. Then she went to her firewood wall, pulled out a dozen pieces, and built up the fire until the cabin was genuinely hot. Gunnar survived. He regained consciousness after an hour and full awareness after 2. The first thing he said when he understood where he was and what had happened was that he had been wrong about her wall. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of February 12th, after 3 full days of continuous snowfall and wind. The world outside emerged transformed. Drifts had accumulated to heights of 8 and 10 feet in exposed areas. Traditional woodpiles across the territory were completely buried. Paths that homesteaders had maintained all winter had disappeared. The landscape was a uniform white expanse, with only the tops of buildings and occasional fence posts visible above the snow. Gunnar remained at Astrid's cabin through the storm's final day, too weak to attempt the journey back to his own homestead until conditions improved. He spent hours sitting by her fire, watching her casually pull firewood from her wall whenever needed, never once struggling or exposing herself to danger. He did not speak much, but Astrid could see him calculating, reconsidering everything he had said about her construction project. When the weather cleared enough for travel, Gunnar prepared to leave. Before departing, he stood in the space between Astrid's cabin and her firewood wall, looking at the structure with new understanding. He said he had called her wall foolish, wasteful, and insane. He had mocked her work and questioned her judgment. He had been completely wrong. The wall had saved his life and proven that traditional methods were inadequate. He asked if she would be willing to explain her construction technique to him. He wanted to build something similar before next winter. Astrid agreed. She walked him around the perimeter, explaining the post placement, frame construction, and stacking method. She showed him how the bark side-out orientation shed water, how the gaps between pieces allowed air circulation, and how the frame structure maintained stability even as sections were partially emptied. Gunnar listened carefully, asking detailed questions about materials, measurements, and costs. His skepticism had transformed into genuine interest. Word of what happened during the blizzard spread quickly. Gunnar told the story honestly, including the part where his own stubbornness had nearly killed him and Astrid's engineering had saved him. Other homesteaders began visiting to examine the wall firsthand. They saw the massive drifts piled against the exterior while the interior remained relatively clear. They saw how easily Astrid could access dry firewood. They saw how much warmer the space inside the wall felt compared to open areas. Sigrid Nystrom came with her husband Carl in late February. They spent a day to Sam, entire afternoons studying the construction, taking measurements, and discussing how they might implement something similar at their own homestead. Sigrid was particularly interested in the frame design and asked if Astrid had drawn plans she could reference. Astrid sketched the basic structure on paper, showing post spacing, frame piece dimensions, and recommended wood stacking patterns. Other visitors included Anders Bjornstad, who arrived in early March on his regular trading circuit. He examined the wall silently for several minutes, then admitted he had expected to find the project abandoned or collapsed. Instead, he found the most innovative homestead construction he had seen in 20 years of frontier trading. He asked if Astrid would mind if he mentioned her design to other homesteaders along his route. Spring came late to Montana Territory in 1874. Snow lingered into April, and temperatures remained cold through early May. But when the thaw finally arrived, it revealed a territory transformed in small but significant ways. 3 homesteaders had begun constructing firewood walls around their cabins using variations of Astrid's design. By summer, that number had grown to 7. By autumn, it included nearly every serious homesteader within 20 miles of Astrid's claim. The designs varied based on available materials and individual preferences. Some built full perimeter walls like Astrid's. Others constructed partial walls on the north and west sides where winter winds hit hardest. Some used her exact post and frame method, while others developed alternative support systems. But all shared the same core principles: bringing firewood close to the dwelling, protecting it from weather, while allowing air circulation and eliminating the deadly gap between shelter and fuel. Astrid helped Sigrid Nystrom build a complete perimeter wall that summer. They worked together, cutting timber and stacking wood, and completed the project in 6 weeks. Carl Nystrom built the frame structure while the women prepared firewood. The collaborative effort created a wall even more refined than Astrid's original, incorporating improvements they had developed through experience. Sigrid's wall included covered sections over the entrance gap, creating a protected walkway that Astrid later added to her own design. The technique spread beyond the immediate region. Anders Bjornstad carried descriptions of the firewood wall concept along his trading routes. Homesteaders in Wyoming Territory began building similar structures. Trappers and prospectors in isolated mountain camps adopted simplified versions. The idea moved organically through frontier communities, adapted and refined by each person who implemented it. Within 5 years, firewood wall construction had become common practice across the northern territories. Astrid continued working her homestead. The wheat and potatoes grew. The livestock multiplied. She hired help during harvest seasons and eventually took on a young Norwegian immigrant as a permanent farmhand. The homestead prospered, and the land proved generous to those willing to work it carefully. She never remarried, finding contentment in independence and the community of neighbors she had come to trust. The winter of 1874-75 passed without incident. Astrid's firewood wall performed flawlessly through multiple storms. Her cabin stayed warm, her wood stayed dry, and she never once felt the fear that had defined the previous winter. She thought often of Leif, but the memories became less painful as time passed. The wall had become a memorial of sorts, a permanent reminder that tragedy could be transformed into innovation if you were willing to work for it. By 1876, historians estimate that firewood wall construction had prevented at least a dozen deaths across Montana and Wyoming territories. The exact number would never be known because survival rarely generated written records, but the technique's adoption rate suggested it solved a problem people desperately needed solved.